Okay, thank you. Just so people know, this is the Irish Family Memorial is down by the Custom House Quay on the River Liffey in Dublin. Was dedicated back in 1997. And when I was in Dublin here in March, I thought it was kind of neat to go take the picture, help bring it into perspective of the things we're going to be talking about. When we talk about looking in our Irish ancestor and ancestors' origins, one of the biggest hurdles that we find is being able to collect the information, sort out fact and fiction from family lore, and try to figure out how the family came to be in the United States. And for a lot of genealogists and family historians, those clues can be kind of daunting and in terms of how we could find out what we need to do to learn about our ancestry. And there's several techniques that can be used, several sources that we'll look at, and I'll give you some specific examples of how you could do that today. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to use a case study of my wife's three times great-grandparents, James and Margaret McCauley, who came from County Cavan and settled in Nebraska. And I'm going to highlight through the slides a little star you'll see occasionally of where I took that information and how I applied it in my analysis. To understand Irish immigration, you kind of have to have appreciation for Irish history. A lot of immigrants, excuse me, left Ireland either part of the Great Famine between 1845 to 1852, or they left because of political upheaval or even religious persecution. As you know, and we'll talk about it, the Church of Ireland was the premier religion in Ireland throughout the 1800s. And a lot of our ancestors came over during that period of political, religious, and famine upheavals. We've passed stories down through our families of how they came here, and we brought the traditions from Ireland. We brought our family stories, but again, those stories may not always be accurate. You know, so in the context of family lore, we have to sort out fact from fiction. And no matter what the circumstances are, we can bring the stories of our family to life by doing good research as we go through the process. Some of the techniques we'll look at, and we'll start with surnames. Family stories and records tell you where you came from. You know, the baptismal records, the marriage certificates, the immigration records, those are great starting points. But one of the places we can all look at is the use of our surnames. And one of the techniques that we use in Irish genealogy is, I call it a heat map visualization. And it gives you a high level view based on your surname, where your family may have come from based on geographic areas. In my syllabus, I will highlight some of these things. So some of the websites we'll be looking at today are in that syllabus that you can download, I believe, at the TopekaLibrary website. One of the ones most Irish genealogists use is Griffith's valuation. Griffith's valuation was basically a tax assessment. They wanted to know who owned the property, who was on the property, who was renting the property. And so we have a host of names that are listed there in Griffith's valuation. Griffith's valuation as a tax assessment took place between 1847 and 1864. And one of the sites I use, and most people look at, is John Grenham's site, johngrenham.com. And I'll show you a couple examples of what that looks like. This is a screenshot of John Grenham's website called Irish Ancestors, or johngrenham.com. And you'll see there at the upper left side of the top where you can click on surnames. And Grenham's site is a paid site. However, when you start, you can use it for free. And so I encourage you to do that. Anybody knows anything about computers, clear your cache and your cookies, and you can keep going back over and over again. So the McCauleys are the family I wanted to focus on. And so using Griffith's valuation and John Grenham's webpage, I was able to find, as you can see here, the McCauleys. You see the heat map visualization where in Ireland the names are predominantly found. Underneath the map, you can see the counties in Ireland where the names are found and the number of times the name McCauley shows up in each county. And Grenham does something else that's wonderful. On the right-hand side, he gives you name variants. So not everybody spelled their name correctly. Not everything gets recorded correctly. So you have the opportunity to look at variations on the name. So using that heat map, I was able to start to do some of the research about the Macaulay family. Now, something else that we use, separate and distinct from surnames, are censuses and census substitutes. And just like the United States, the Irish government did censuses every 10 years. They started in 1801, finished up in 1911. The 1921 census will be coming out soon, and we can take a look at that. Prior to 1821, it was done just for statistics. The 1821 to 1851 censuses, however, were destroyed in the Four Courts fire. That happened, if you recall, during the period of Irish independence. The Republicans versus the traditionalists, had a war, and somehow the courthouse burned down. Think of the Four Courts as our national archives. But not everything was lost. They still have stuff. But then the Irish government did some other stupid things. 1861, 1891, they decide, hey, we didn't have the space, so we'll just shred the stuff. So those are lost. But there's some that still exist. Partial fragments do exist. So we use things in addition to the censuses, like Griffin's valuation. We use what's called valuation revision books, because just like today, our tax assessors will say your property is worth this much this year, and 3 or 4 years later, they'll come back and evaluate the property, and somebody else is living there, it's worth something else. So those books exist. And we also, in Northern Ireland, at the Public Records Office in Northern Ireland, PRONI, have things like school records, and those are readily available. So if your ancestor went to school, you can pick up those pieces of information as well. So census substitutes another source of information. Here's an example of what Griffin's valuation looks like, and I give you 2 specific case points. Keppel Disney, you see him on the top there, circled. He was the father of Walt and Roy Disney. So he was recorded in Griffin's valuation. You can see he rented his property from an individual named James Dunby. He had land, and how much the value of the land was, the productivity of the land was part of his assessment. One below is Patrick Kennedy's entry in Griffin's valuation. He was the great-grandfather of John Kennedy. He lived in County Wexford, same thing there. He rented property from a guy named George and Adam Glasscott, and what he rented, what the value of the property was. So you can see how Griffin's valuation can give you some information. It's from Griffin's valuation that John Grenham's heat maps can be generated. So you've got that tie-in as well. Other sources of like census information are things like the Tithe of Plothman, Tithe Defaulters records. I mentioned that the Church of Ireland was the primary religion in Ireland. So everybody who owned property had to pay a tithe to the Church of Ireland. Tithe defaulters, the people who didn't want to pay the tithe, so they got recorded too. So you have a record of those type of people. The hearth money rolls are, if you had a hearth in your house, 1662, 66, they recorded those people had the hearth. Flax growers and spinning lists, and I'll show that to you in just a second, but Ireland produced what back in the 1700s? Lots of linen. And so the Irish government gave spinning wheels away to farmers so the people could spin the flax into linen and make linen a major export item from Ireland. Freeholders list were people who are free and own land. County religious censuses were done by the Church of Ireland, and estate records, of course, are records as well. Here's an example of the Irish flax grower hearth money rolls, and you can see this is just a screenshot of that site, but it lists the counties in which the spinning wheels were given away, the names of the people who got the spinning wheels, and did they, in fact, contribute to the Irish economy. Other things that we look at when we do Irish genealogy are church records. Clearly, understanding your family's religious traditions goes a long way in helping you with your Irish research. In Ireland, the National Library of Ireland has digitized parish registers from the Roman Catholic parishes in Ireland. And I'll show you an example a little bit later of what that looks like. JohnGrenham.com has links to those sites. RootsIreland.ie also has it, and IrishGenealogy.ie has it. I'll point out that IrishGenealogy.ie is run by the Irish Tourism Bureau. For Americans and other people that want to go to Ireland and do your research, they have a free website. So again, these are in the syllabus. I would recommend you go to those and you take advantage of those things where you can. The Church of Ireland has started digitizing their records. They're not very far along. Some of the things are PDF, but that's ireland.anglican.org. The Presbyterian Historical Society also has some records that you could look at as well. And if you really, truly want to get down to at the lower level, if you know the parish from which your ancestors came, you can contact the local church or archdiocese and request records from them. This is an example. I told you about irishgenealogy.ie. This is the one by the Irish Tourism Bureau. If you want church, and this is a search of all available church records that they've got access to. And one thing I will mention is that every county in Ireland is attempting to digitize as many records as they can. So from week to week, I get updates as to new records being brought online. So if you happen to know your family came from County Cavan or County Meath or Cork or someplace like that, I encourage you to check at least monthly to see what new records have been posted out there online. But this is an example of how easy Irish Genealogy, the Tourism Bureau, has put it together. If you know a last name, you know a location, you have a year range, you can click on that and I'll provide you some information. That star again indicates I'll use that for my case study today. Another place you can go to are the General Records Office of Ireland. The General Records Office of Ireland recorded births, deaths, and marriages for a number of our ancestors. And Family Search, which I encourage you to use, which is free, can also provide you some information as to what's available from them. A couple things on that. The Church of Ireland was the predominant religious activity. So anyone born in Ireland at the time had to report themselves to the civil authorities in order to have their births or marriages recorded, regardless of religious persuasion. That's not to say, like in the case of the Roman Catholics, that the births and marriages were recorded at those levels. And the reason they did that is because, again, the church also was tied, Church of Ireland was also tied in with the civil authorities. So the civil records were tied to these type of individual activities that you would have. Some of the transcripts of the local registrars are available at rootsireland.ie and irishgenealogy.ie. Now, one thing that you won't find is a lot of death records. Catholic Church, for example, did not consider death or burials to be a sacramental function. Therefore, the Church of Ireland or the Catholic Church records do not necessarily always reflect deaths. Also, burials in Ireland were dependent upon where the religious persuasion of the particular family. If a person died in the period of time in the 1880s, 1870s in Ireland and you're Catholic, you may not have been necessarily recorded as being buried in a specific point. Again, because the penal laws and some other things that had to do with Irish families and religious activities. Talking about cemetery records, I recommend that if you're doing research into your family, you take a look at those cemetery records, even if they're not available. There's a couple of examples. Discover Ever After is a site similar to Find a Grave for Northern Ireland. Interment.net is attempting to be much like Find a Grave in Ireland. And you may find, for example, in the case of Dublin, where they have individual ones. Here's an example of glassnodentrust.ie, where they're trying to keep track of burials in Dublin city cemeteries and in the counties in and around Dublin. Of course, in the United States, sometimes we can find our information about our ancestors, about Find a Grave, Billions of Grave, and as I said, some Irish cemeteries are starting to be added to Find a Grave as well. Here's a screenshot of what interment.net looks like. You can put in the name just like you do in the United States with Find a Grave. You can select the county from which your ancestor may have been buried and pull that down, and those searches will come up much like we do with Find a Grave here in the United States. Property records, another source of information that you could look at. And the tithe-apotment books, I mentioned how landowners were charged tithe. So you could look at the National Archives of Ireland to find who's the landowner, what they own. I mentioned Griffin valuation maps. In Northern Ireland, the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland has something very similar in their valuation office. If your family descended from gentry, you may find your family's names recorded in the landed estate records. Those did not necessarily record the people who are renting land on those estates. And of course, just like in the United States, registry of deeds offices in the various counties, if your ancestor owned property, may have wills and codicils associated with that property that they may have owned. When you come to the United States and you start going through US records, you may find your ancestor decided to become an American citizen. So a declaration of intent, after they've been here 2 years and they've established their residency, they could say, I want to become an American citizen. Those declarations of intent were generally filed at the county courthouse in the state from which your ancestor lived. They were not the federal naturalization process did not begin until in the early 1900s. So up until that point in time, all your naturalization, all your declaration of intent records were filed at the county courthouse. And most times the declaration of intent would say, here's the ancestor's name, here's where they came from in Ireland, here's when they came to the United States. So you can find corroborating information about your ancestor as they came here. After 3 years of being in the United States, they could file a petition for naturalization and become a naturalized citizen. And there are census records, US Census records, that show, was the person a naturalized citizen? Therefore, you can go back and take a look at where they lived and then check the county courthouse to find those types of records. And you'll see that in the census records, they'll show NA is naturalized, no report, or that they were in fact an alien and did not register, become an American citizen. The other thing I encourage you to use, another source, are obituaries in newspapers. Oftentimes our ancestors, if they lived over in Ireland for any period of time, would record their obituaries in the Irish newspapers. One is the Irish News Archives, which collects 20th century newspapers. The Irish Times has an archive that dates back to 1859. And Find My Past IE, which is a website. It's a subscription-based service, but I use that a lot when I'm trying to find a lot of detailed information. Not to do a commercial for Find My Past, but they have multiple different things and multiple types of records that you can find. If your ancestor owned a dog, the dog licenses are listed at findmypast.com. And anybody owned a dog in Ireland had to record their dog and what kind of dog it was, where they lived, and so on. You can also look at newspapers.com, genealogybank.com, newspaperarchive.com, and Library of Congress has, of course, chroniclingAmericaLLC.gov, which also has access to newspapers that you might be able to research. As I said, there are ethnic newspapers that are out there. Find My Past is one. Genealogy Bank is another. Find My Past, for those that are interested, Midwest Genealogy Center allows you to access, if you have a library card, from Find My Past, so you don't have to pay the subscription. The New England Historic Genealogical Society, AmericanAncestors.org, is a wonderful site, again, subscription-based, but it does provide you access to information that might be contained in local newspapers, especially about your ancestors. And of course, state libraries and archives have that as well. Here's a screenshot of the Irish Newspaper Archive. So again, you can go in, enter in, decide what county you're going to research, what time period you're going to research. a name that you might want to research, and it'll pull that up for you. Another thing to look at are passenger lists and ship manifests. Those, again, this is a starred one, so I'm going to show you how I use that. Ancestry.com has ship manifests and the passenger list. Family Search as well. If your family came in through Ellis Island, the Ellis Island website, which is free, allows you to do a name search against that. If your family came in through Castle Garden before the time period for Ellis Island, castlegarden.org also has a surname search for ancestors. And occasionally, maiden names of family members might be listed on those lists as well. So always check the surname of the family, but occasionally you want to check the maiden name of the family as well. So given those sources, now you have to start asking yourself, before you get started, what are you interested in? What do you want to find? So these are some basic questions that most people would want to have answers to. First off, did my ancestor come from Ireland? Who was in his or her family? Who were their parents? Did they have brothers and sisters? When did they come to the United States? Why did they come to the United States? What possible reason brought them out of Ireland to over here? And when you start doing that, you start to look at things here that we have, like vital records. For us, generally, that's a good place to start, especially after 1900, but you can find things before. You always want to identify who the informant of the information is and how that person was likely to know what the information was. I'll use an example today. If you find a death certificate of somebody recently posted, and it says they were born in such and such a location, such and such a date, you've got to ask yourself the question, who gave them that information? Was that secondhand information provided to a daughter, a son, a cousin, who may not have been present at the time of the birth of the person? So you always question who's the person providing the information, because it may not always be accurate. And since birth, marriage, and death records sometimes indicate that where the Irish townland is the smallest geographical configuration of a population center in Ireland. Think of it as a suburb or a small hamlet or something like that. And you go from townland to county and province and so on. So here's my example, and this is where my case study started. My wife, I was trying to figure out if she could become a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Her 7 times great-grandfather, Francis Parvin, was in the Revolutionary War. He was at Mount Vernon. He was a drummer and a bugler and all that stuff. And so I followed the descendancy tree to see what I could do. And where the red arrow is the point when a cousin had finished everything prior to that. So I can take that information, apply for a DAR stuff, but I have to substantiate from that point down. And my challenge was finding Laura Mary Hoover, second person from the bottom on the left, because she was my wife's great-grandmother. And I started to look at her tree to figure out more about her, because I had to substantiate her lineage to tie her back to the Revolutionary War soldier. So I started looking at Laura Mary Hoover's mother, and her mother was a lady named Mary Ann Marie McCauley, who died in Kimio, Kansas in 1936. And I found her obituary, again, using these sources I just talked about, that she was born in Rome, New York in 1849. And with all the artifacts, you get the papers, the scrapbook and everything else, I found an obituary from Creighton, Nebraska, March 1921. So I couldn't use that for the DAR application, but it said that her obituary, that she married her husband, Margaret Coyle McCauley, in 1848 in County Cavan, and came to the United States. So that was my starting point to figure out who McCauley's were. So there's the obituary that I found in the Creighton, Nebraska News, 1921. And I highlighted two parts of the obituary, which gave me some of the information that I could use to start this search. And the obituary said that Margaret Coyle was born in County Cavan, Ireland, 17 March 1828. She married James Macaulay, also of County Cavan, in 1848. She and her husband moved the same year. Okay, immigration records now, 1848, they came to the United States. In 1882, they moved to Knox County, Nebraska, and they farmed south of Creighton, Nebraska. They both owned a Brown Hotel until 1901. James died in 1901. There's a correlation there, I guess, between the ownership of the hotel and his passing away. They had 11 children, one of which was Margaret Macaulay Hoover, my wife's second great grandmother, who I was trying to find information on to fulfill the DAR application. And Margaret Coyle died March 1921. So here in this one obituary, I found birth date, Irish location, marriage of a husband, husband's name, and when they came to the United States. So again, going back to looking at the sources, what you can find. So the first step I took was I said, okay, she married James Macaulay, 1848, County Cavan. She was buried, her funeral was held at St. Mary's Catholic Church in O'Neill, Nebraska, according to the obituary. So I made the assumption she was a Roman Catholic and obviously may have been baptized and married as a Roman Catholic in Ireland. So I used johngrenham.com to do that heat map assessment. And I looked at the names Macaulay and Coyle, her name, her surname, his surname. I then used Roots Ireland to search the marriage records for Margaret Coyle and her husband with the surname Macaulay. And I found an index indicated they're married on 4 May 1848 in the parish of Anna. I then used the National Library of Ireland digitized images of Catholic parish registers, and I found their marriage record. So I followed the same record, but I wasn't able to find baptismal records for them. So I've got to figure out who their parents are. Well, let me show you the examples of how this worked. First off, just to give you perspective, these are the 32 counties in Ireland. And if you look, I can walk over here. Up here, the orange one, here's County Meath, there's Dublin County, Meath, the orange is Cavan. So County Cavan is where they came from. This is a map of the civil parishes of County Cavan. So I kind of knew what they were. There's also documents similar to this that indicate the religious parishes of County Cavan. So I was able to zero in on what those were. But you can see, as I said, civil records in County Cavan were maintained by the local government, religious documents, County Cavan by the Catholic Church. So using the heat map on Macaulay's, I think I showed you this earlier, here's where they were. But one of the unique features that John Grinham has is you can tag it to an associate name. So I could do a heat map of both Macaulay and Coyle. And I did that. And this is the heat map I get from John Grinham when I did that and show where they are. And I already know where they're in County Cavan. So that in the upper circle, that larger one just to the upper left of Dublin is that area of concentration I was looking for. So then going into the next step, I went to rootsireland.ie. Rootsireland.ie allowed me to enter in the marriage records for Ireland. Coyle, Margaret, I knew her name. I knew they were married in 1848, but I gave it a plus or minus 5 years to get in the ballpark. And her spouse's name was Macaulay. I selected all the counties just to make sure I was on the right track to see if there's any other correlation to that. And sure enough, what happens is I found the marriage records on rootsireland.ie. It shows me their dates of marriage between Margaret Coyle and James Macaulay, 4 May 1848, parish of Anna, County Cavan. And they're Roman Catholic, as I suspected. So, okay, now I've done that. Now, then I decide, okay, I'm going to go to the National Library of Ireland, start searching the Catholic parish registers. Now, this is what the page looks like on their digitized site. The one down in the lower right, as I pointed with the yellow arrow, is where the entry is. And this is what the entry says. Now, here's my caution. Those records are written in Latin with priests that didn't have great penmanship, and that is across the board for all those records. So you have to kind of sit there and decipher what it says. What this says, though, in Latin, and I've got the translation there, joined in marriage, James Macaulay, and they spelled it differently, and Margaret Coyle. Witnesses were Patrick Gleason and Mary Smith, and I've listed the citation there as to where I found it. So I was able to correlate from the obituary all the way to the point where I found now their marriage record. Okay, her obituary said they left Ireland the same year they're married, so 1848. So I had to ask the question, as any good historian would do, why did they leave? Well, County Cavan was hit hardest by the Great Famine that again occurred between 1845 and 1849, ending in 1852. And in 1847, the potato crop was a total loss, no food. And throughout the winter of 1847, there are a high number of deaths due to cholera, starvation, and typhus. And one of the things that you find as you study Irish history is that the Irish poor laws were instituted so that the landowners had to pay for the poor law unions, the poorhouses to which people went. Unfortunately, those poorhouses were in such terrible shape that no one wanted to go there, except that they're totally destitute and had nowhere else to go. And the landlords being assessed on property as based on how many people lived on their rented land were then encouraged to get rid of the people and move them on so that they wouldn't have to pay the per head tax on the land that the landlord owned. So oftentimes the landlords paid the tenants to leave, or they evicted them and hoped they'd move out of the local area. And one of the most famous County Cavan eviction events was something called the Lough Sheelin eviction. It occurred in November 1848. So this is before my wife's ancestors, or after my wife's ancestors left. But that particular landlord in Tonau evicted 700 tenants, put them out on the road, no food, no means of support, get out of here. There's a song, I don't think I can play it here, called By Lough Sheelin's Side, which is a ballad that describes the conditions of the evicted tenants as they left County Cavan to leave to go somewhere else. So it's kind of a sad discussion, but it gave me appreciation for why my wife's great-grandparents left. So going forward, I looked at what they did. I found that they left on board a ship called the Swan on 30 October 1848, and they got to the United States on 30 November 1848. Again, corresponds to the obituary information I found. I don't know how they got from County Cavan to Dublin, but that was the closest port to leave to go to Liverpool. And the distance is about 120 kilometers, so about 72 miles. So whether they walked, they rode carts, I don't know, but that was the way they would have to go. The steerage passage to go in 1848 from Liverpool to London was about 3 pounds, or about $4 back in 2022. And it would have been cramped, no ventilation, inadequate food, water, no sanitation. They're all just jammed on the ship and off they went. Hence the term coffin ships. Sometimes, though, landlords did pay the cost of passage, but the captains didn't get the money until the passengers were delivered to the United States in an alive condition. They died overboard on the way over. The captain didn't get any money. And the passenger entries only record the name, occupation, where they came from, and where they were going when they came to the United States. So with this information, those immigration records I was talking about, I was able to find James Colley and wife Margaret arriving in the United States. This is on Ancestry, aboard the Swan, coming from Liverpool to New York, 1848. And as I said, it gives you your name, where they came from, where they were going. In this case, Rome, New York. He was a seedsman. In other words, he sold seed. And she was just a common laborer at 20 years of age. So I've tried to research why they went to Upper New York State, Rome, New York. And apparently there are a lot of Irish people there. This was close to where the Erie Canal was, so there was lots of hard work available for people who wanted to do it. There were some businesses, commercial operations associated with the Erie Canal. So, and I found there were a lot of Irish people living in that area. So, as I said, James reported his age was 25, Margaret was 20, and that helped me try to kind of figure out what their birth dates were, which would help me in future research. Also found in the 1850 census, so shortly after they arrived, that they had a daughter and they were living in Constantia, Oswego County, New York. So tried to figure out, okay, what are they going to do? Where did they go? Well, lots of stuff, and I just summarized into a single chart. You can see here, they were in the 1850 census. They had a son that was born in 1851 in December, another son in Upper New York State, 1852. They were in the 1855 census, so taking advantage of not only the federal census, but the state censuses. I found them in Illinois in 1857 when they had a daughter that was born, another federal census. In Illinois in 1860, 1870, they moved to Dubuque, Iowa, not very far from where they were in Illinois. And then in 1884, I found him in Knox County, Nebraska, and they continued to live there until both James passes away and Margaret died. So up in the upper north central part of Nebraska. So this is kind of the mapping I saw of how they arrived in the United States, 1848, and how they ended up out in Nebraska. So part of the family history. Yes, go ahead.
Or does the census already tell us this? Moving from New York to Illinois to Iowa to Nebraska. Did you just look under the name in the general census and that's how you determined?
And I had some birth records of children, and so I can kind of correlate all those things too.
Thank you.
So I'm asking myself, okay, why are they going to Nebraska? What was different from Illinois, Iowa to Nebraska? Well, if you look at American history as opposed to Irish history, there was a belief that American way of life was keep moving west, manifest destiny. And the promise, like I say here, of untapped resources, land, freedom, wide open spaces. But there's also a lot of pull, and talk about push-pull migration, and no matter what the ancestry is, oftentimes people had moved to places where family members had already settled and written back, or somebody knew someone that had gone there and decided to follow in their footsteps. So as I say, many settlers moved west to join family or friends who had already done it. I don't know that that's the case in this case. I do know that when James and Margaret moved to New York State, there were people that they knew that they moved to New York State to be with. So there was that push to get from where you were starting from to another location. Again, also the westward push, there was a lot of population centers of the United States were along the eastern seaboard. It was crowded, maybe not, there weren't any jobs, maybe not opportunities. So moving west seems to be the best thing they could do. Oh, I all know about the Homestead Act, and that was one of the real driving forces, especially across Nebraska and across Kansas for that matter, in getting people to move to the west, because the railroads were buying up the land. The railroads then were buying land alongside the railroad tracks, encouraging settlements there, and that was part of the drive to come out here. Here's a picture of the first homestead in the United States in Beatrice, Nebraska. If you haven't done it, I encourage you to go up to the National Park Service Homestead Park. National Park Service runs it up in Beatrice, Nebraska. And if you have Nebraska ancestors who homesteaded, you can find their records in their repository there. The other draw that I found as I was doing this research is that people were going to where other Irish settlers had settled. And here in Kansas, I did not know this till I started this research, is there were settlements of Irish here in Kansas that drew people. Some of the examples I have here, Jewell County, a lot of people came from Syracuse, New York in the late 1870s. And that kind of ties back into what the Macaulays did being in upper New York State. Marshall County around Frankfort had something that was called Irish Creek. It was a small settlement in 1856, and a lot of people arrived during that period pre-Civil War. Okay, thank you. Seneca, Kansas had an area called Coal Creek where people were starting to settle that were Irish that came here. So if I looked at where some of these things are, and this is a newspaper, 1980 published, it calls The Irish Arrive in Kansas. As I said, you can kind of look at some of the places like Chapman, St. George, Seneca, and where the railroads were as part of that encouragement for that Western migration, especially associated with the Homestead Act. And again, these were Irish settlements, Seneca, St. George, Chapman, that were associated with the coming of the railroads. So my question then was, why O'Neill, Nebraska? What was special about O'Neill, Nebraska? Well, it was founded by a guy named General John O'Neill, who was a veteran of the United States Civil War. And he really wasn't a general. He was like a colonel. But a lot of admirers called him general. But he got involved with the Irish independence movement in the mid-1860s after the American Civil War. And he joined a group of people called the Fenians. Now, if you think about the Fenians, they were early forerunners of the Irish Republican Army. They wanted to get Ireland as a free state, separate from the United Kingdom, and they were doing everything they possibly could to do that. So in 1875, O'Neill, after some problems with the Fenians, wrote a pamphlet called Northern Nebraska as a Home for Immigrants and encouraged Irish immigration into that area of Nebraska. And in O'Neill, they've got a picture of this guy, that town founder. But started doing research on the Fenians, and I found out again that they were known as also as the Irish Republican Brotherhood. It was a secret organization, much like the IRA was that we knew in the 1970s and 80s. And they planned on trying to do battle in Canada. And I was in New Brunswick, Canada, at St. John, and found this tower that overlooked the town. And the Fenians tried 3 times to take that tower, to take the town of New Brunswick, or St. John. They failed. And so the Fenians kind of gave up on any North American attacks in Canada after that event. But that didn't dissuade O'Neill from going to set up his town in O'Neill, Nebraska. So going back, my wife and I went up to O'Neill, Nebraska and took a look through Find a Grave and found Margaret and James Macaulay's headstone. And Margaret's headstone reads 1825, 1921. James gives me the dates, died December 18, 1900, aged 80 years, 9 months, 2 days. So I kind of have an idea of when he might have been born to help me go back and figure that piece out in Ireland. So what did I learn from the obituary? I was able to locate their Irish marriage and immigration records confirming the 1848 dates. The census records confirmed their residency in 1850 and 1855, which was in the obituary. I took a look at other census information indicating their residency in Illinois and Iowa. Found out that James not only was a seedsman when he came over, but he was a gardener, day laborer, a farmer, and eventually a hotel proprietor. Naturalization records show that James applied for naturalization in 1884, and Margaret lived the rest of her life with one of her sons and a daughter before she passed.
What was the son a resident?
Yes, they're all in O'Neill or Creighton, that area.
Maybe they came first, or
No,
maybe they all came together.
no, the 2 parents came from Ireland. All the kids were born in the United States. They all came together. Yeah, it was a family move. So this is Margaret Macaulay Hoover, the daughter, sitting in the middle of Margaret and James, and that's my wife's second great grandmother. So what are my next steps? You know, being a genealogist, nothing ever, okay. Nothing ever is over with. So James' headstone indicates that he died at the number of years, months, and days he was. That says he was possibly born March 14, 1820. I've got to go dig through the National Library of Ireland Irish records for possible baptismal records. Now, if you're looking for Roman Catholic baptismal records, it's probably going to be close to that birth date because the baptisms generally occurred within a day or two of birth. You'll find if you look at civil records, births could be recorded as much as a month later. And so that's because there was a taxation through the penal laws that occurred on that as well. Family ephemera indicated that Margaret was born on March 17th, 1828. So that's another thing I could look for to see if in fact I can find her stuff. Well, as I said, my primary person of interest was one of their 11 children, my wife's second great grandmother. I might be able to find other informations on other sibling family histories where they might have put something in their obituaries that could add to it. But at this point, I don't think I can find that, but I'll try it. I discovered church index records for St. Peter's Church in Rome in Oneida, New York, in which James and Margaret is listed as the parents of a child, and there are baptismal witnesses. So as I talk about push-pull, those neighbors or friends through the fan, Elizabeth Shawn Mills talks about friends, acquaintances, and neighbors, the fan club. They may have been people who came from Ireland or settled in that area from Ireland or knew people from Ireland, which may be able to tie something in there as well. And in 1850 census, James and Margaret are recorded as living with Patrick McDonald and Margaret McDonald. So when they got up to New York State, they were living with somebody else. Again, that may establish a relationship of somebody who might have lived in Ireland. And I need to look at that to see when they may have come to the United States and from where, and if they were also from part of County Cavan. So tying together that fan club. So a lot of information, a lot of sources you could look at, and you can kind of see how I took those sources and correlated them into a family story and try to put some flesh on the bones of what the family history was. Any questions?
At one point, you noted that naturalization kind of things, there might be a symbol for pending or naturalized or so forth. And I believe you said that came from census.
The federal census.
When did they start including that?
1880 and in 1910, and that's the only time they really looked at it, or 1900 rather, and that was the only time they did it. There are other things that associated with post-World War I, which had to deal with alien status, because if people wanted to know what that was all about. Any other questions? Yes.
Being that Ireland, Scotland, and England is just all United Kingdom. If you also have relatives in Scotland and England, as I do, are similar websites set for each country?
Yes.
It's not United Kingdom.
No, it's, yeah. So if you're going to do Scottish research, there are things you look at. One of the things I would look at would be, I mentioned the Presbyterian records. Many of the Scots-Irish that came over were Scots-Irish or were Presbyterians. And when you do Scots-Irish research, generally I found, and this is another lecture I do on that, but generally the Scots-Irish came in through Philadelphia as a port of entry. And there are, yes, and they established residency there and then eventually moved down what I used to live in Virginia along Interstate 81 through the Shenandoah Valley. This is called the Old Wagon Road. And you may find if you're doing research into Scots-Irish ancestors, especially as they do the Western migration, that they may have been registered in the vestries of Presbyterian churches along that route. So if you happen to know, based on family history, where they may have lived, you might check the Presbyterian church records in that area of Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, and so on.
Curious, if you go back another 100 years, 1750s. These records, but how far back?
Yeah, generally, except for about 1820, and it's generally only those records that are associated with civil government and the Church of Ireland. You know, Catholic records, if you had Roman Catholic and Irish ancestors, don't really exist other than about the 1840s when you have the parish records. And one of the unique things about this is that the Catholic Church didn't share those records with the National Archives. So when the fire took place, during the unpleasantness, they didn't get burnt. They were there. And so some of the other civil parishes also had their records stored at the local parish sites, even though some duplicate records are kept at the parish site. Some of the originals were the National Archives, four courts.
Yeah, mine came 1770.
Yeah, and when you get back in those days, very seldom do you find any immigration records. There might be some occasional ones. I showed you those early, almost colonial times where a group of pastors might get together and put an ad in thanking Captain Smith for the pleasant voyage, and they would list their names, but very seldom happened.
Came into Pennsylvania.
Right.
You got a common name.
Right. Which is why that name variant thing is so important.
Thank you so much, John.
Okay, you're welcome.
Very good.